It's time to make a bowl out of this rock hard piece of oak. Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. Today we're going to turn this very old piece of oak. This piece of wood was given to me by Tim in Pennsylvania. Thank you, Tim. Tim got it from a salvage company that salvages old buildings and barns, and believe it or not, this was just a cutoff. What a beautiful cutoff. So we're going to take a look at this. It's got some beautiful saw marks on it that appear to be a very large circular saw. I would love to have seen the saw that cut this originally. This also has what appears to be almost no moisture in it at all. It is very dense, very heavy. It's rock hard, and that is part of the reason Tim sent it to me. He wanted to know how we can best deal with wood that is really hard and how we can turn that efficiently when we take it to the lathe. So that's what we're going to do today. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn a slightly closed rim, where the rim comes in just a touch, bowl out of this particular blank, and we'll see how it turns out. So let's dive in and get turning. I want to make sure I get the most out of this bowl blank, so I'm going to use a compass and find the very edge of the piece. At the bandsaw, when I'm cutting this, I want to make sure I don't go inside that circle at all. If I go inside that circle, then I need to basically reduce the entire bowl blank by that new lower dimension. So it's better to be outside the line than inside that line at any point. So you'll see here on the corners, I'm going to have a little bit of excess that's sticking out, but that's no big deal. I'll just turn that away. I just want to make sure I don't go inside that line. And wow, you can see that this wood is very hard, and it's really working that blade. I'm trying not to push the blank through too quickly, but it is really, really hard. Before I even start at the lathe, I'm going to get everything sharpened up. This is my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. I'm going to sharpen that first. And then I'm going to take a moment to also sharpen my 5/8 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. These both have the same profile, so they're both in the same configuration on the sharpening station. So it's best just to sharpen both them at the same time. This is interesting. There's a little buildup there you can see on the bevel. And I have to wonder, it's like cooking. You know, when you cook with sugars at high heat in a pan, they'll stick and they'll burn and they'll kind of caramelize. And I'm wondering if the heat of the bowl gouge, the bowl I turned previously was a wet piece, and I'm wondering if it takes the sugars out of the wood and burns those onto the side of the bowl blank. It's just kind of an interesting thought there. Okay, so I'm going to mount the bowl blank between centers on the lathe. This is between a 4-jaw drive center and the tailstock, and I have the grain-oriented, so the pith is on the outside or the bottom of the bowl. That's similar to the way I would mount a live edge or a natural edge bowl. Now I'm using the tailstock, loosening it up and readjusting to make sure I've got this seated properly, and I'm essentially want to make sure I've got a relatively flat top edge so I'm not wasting any extra material. And I'm going to slowly bring the lathe up to speed. And the first cut I'm going to make is across the end grain here. And if you take my wood bowl turning start to finish online e-course, this is the first cut that we're going to make together with the bowl gouge. And in that course, I will teach you all of the steps for using the bowl gouge. And after you've followed all the exercises in the course and practiced, you're going to feel very confident using the bowl gouge. Okay, so I'm making a few passes here, basically clean that up. There's still a couple flat spots there you can see, but I'm just slowly bringing that down. I don't want to waste any material here, so I'm just going to slowly creep up on that maximum diameter of this bowl. It seems to be cutting pretty well. You really want to make sure you're riding the bevel when you're making these cuts, because you can see this wood is so dry and so hard. It doesn't have tear out like most woods do. It's just leaving scratch marks. It's almost like cutting a stone. A little bit of flat spot here, so I'm going to make one more light cut. What I'm doing is I'm orienting the flute to the right. If the flute straight up is 12 o'clock, then I've got it oriented to the right at about 1:30. And I'm pushing along the tool rest, not the bowl blank. I'm just trying to make a nice smooth pass along the tool rest and clean up that edge. All right, now I'm going to do a face cut. If you take the Wood Bowl Turning online e-course, this is the second cut you're going to do with the bowl gouge. I'm just going to make a nice, clean, smooth face cut here just to clean up that bottom of the bowl so that we can see what everything looks like and then have an area to establish the tenon. I'm going to mark the tenon location with my dividers, and then I'll continue making those push cuts to remove the material around the tenon. I have the bowl at about the highest speed that I want to take it. It's very symmetrical and balanced. However, the material is very hard and it's cutting slow, so what I need to do in this situation is to slow down my pace. So instead of just making a quick pass across there like I might do with a green bowl blank, I need to slow down to make sure I get a nice clean pass while I'm making this cut. So I've established the tenon, and now I'm going to create a shoulder. Creating the tenon with the shoulder gives me a lot of leeway later when I want to shape that foot of the bowl. Okay, so now with the tenon and the shoulder established, I can start shaping the curve of the exterior of the bowl. Because sharp cutting edge is at a premium here with this bowl gouge, I'm basically able to use both wings. When I was making those initial cuts to the right, I was using the right wing and the right tip. Now I'm using the left wing and the left tip by making a push cut out along the curve. Now I'm going to change the position of the tool rest, and I'm going to make a pulling scraping cut to remove some of that material. What I want to do is I want a nice smooth curve that goes all the way through the foot of the bowl up to the apex of the curve of the side of the bowl. You can see with the bowl gouge in almost a horizontal position, this is a scraping cut. This is designed to remove material relatively quickly, and it's actually working quite well. That left wing is doing a great job. This is why I love the swept back bowl gouge, because it has so many different capabilities in different situations. I can pull out this scrape cut and shape this bowl very quickly by just making that pulling scraping cut. Okay, so now I'm going to turn around and cut in the supported grain direction and finish out this curve, or better define this curve going up to the apex of this bowl. When I say apex, I'm going to be doing a closed rimmed bowl, meaning the top of the bowl and the rim is going to be a little bit narrower than the widest part of the bowl, which is this outer curve here. Now I'm using a shear scrape. Shear scrape is just like a scraping cut, except I'm dropping the handle of the bowl gouge, and I'm closing the flute, so I'm basically just shaving the surface of the wood. And what's great about this is a super way to take out tool marks or any kind of imperfections. You can do some light shaping with it, but this is more of a refinement cut to smooth the surface of the bowl. I do have a video all about shear scraping if you want to check that out. It's in my library here on YouTube. Okay, so now with the bottom established, I'm going to work on the rim. First thing I want to do is true up that top edge, and I'm going to do that with a scraping cut. I want to close that flute so I don't get a nasty catch. And I'm going to clear away a little bit of the material so I've got a smooth edge and I can see exactly where the top of the bowl is going to be. And in order to have a supported grain cut, if you've seen my supported grain video, which is which way do I turn with a bowl gouge, this is the answer to the trick question. You're going to want to check that out if you haven't seen it already. Okay, I'm creating a little bead that I'm going to have on the rim of this bowl. And the bowl gouge is doing an okay job, but I really need to define that edge a little bit better. So I'm actually going to use my carbide scraper to get underneath that and make a really nice defined edge on the bottom portion of that bead. And then I'll come in and refine that a little more. You can see how hard this wood is and how the corner of that scraper is just making ugly marks. So I'm going to reposition the tool rest so that I've got about a 90-degree support, and I'm going to use that shear scrape to smooth the curve and the apex or the high point of the bowl. You can tell it's a shear scrape that I have the handle down lower because of the shavings. They're usually more fine and thin on a shear scrape. All right, it's time to sharpen again. Now I'm using a depth gauge here. I set my depth to 2 inches with this particular sharpening system, and some people do like 1 3/4 inches, but I use 2 inches. Whatever depth you determine, you just need to be consistent with it. I actually have the plans for a DIY depth gauge, just like the one I use here in my shop. If you go to turnawoodbowl.com/shop, you can see that, the plans for that. Okay, so now I've repositioned the tool rest, and I'm going to use a light scraping cut to take out those tool marks underneath the bead and smooth that material and bring that edge or that side of the exterior up to the high point of the outside of the bowl. So essentially we're working up to the curved highest point of the exterior. I started to shape the rim with my bowl gouge, and then it's too big to get in there. So what I'm using here is my 3/8 inch spindle detail gouge. This has a nice long point that can get down into that groove and clean it up. I usually use this tool to shape the dovetail on my tenons, but this is also a great application for it here. Now remember, don't ever use a spindle gouge for removing large amounts of material.
If you're liking this video, do me a huge favor and click that like button below the screen. You have the thumbs up, go ahead and click that. Thanks.
Okay, so the exterior of the bowl is complete. So I'm going to go ahead and sand that while I have it in this orientation and I have good access to the bottom of the bowl. What I do is I sand with the lathe running, and I'm starting here at 120 grit, and I will work through 120, 180 grit, 240, and 320 to get a really nice smooth finish. I typically turn the lathe speed down to about half of what I was using when I was turning. Okay, now I'm going to come in with that 3/8 inch detail spindle gouge, and I'm going to shape the dovetail of the tenon. Just pushing inward at about a 10-11 degree angle, and I'm also going to clean up the surface of that shoulder because that's going to sit right on the top of the 4-jaw chuck. All right, so the outside of the bowl is complete. Now we can turn it around and take out the inside. I'm going to pull out that drive center, and I'm going to put on my 4-jaw chuck now. Now this is the chuck that actually doesn't seat really well, and that's why I have that little washer on there, is for this particular chuck. It helps fill in that gap. You don't want to have any gaps or any kind of loose fittings coming from the headstock through your turning. Otherwise you're going to have vibrations and you're going to have issues while you're turning. You want to make sure you have the secure connection and a true connection so everything rotates properly. All right, so I'm back using my 1/2 inch 55 degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. This is my go-to bowl gouge I use for almost everything that I do. It is just the true workhorse. And if you want to turn a bowl and you're looking for a tool to get and you're not sure which one, the 1/2 inch bowl gouge is one to get. Okay, so I'm going to be working the rim area, and I'm going to be working the wall first. I'm not going to core from the center out. I want to control that wall thickness and the rim and have good control over that. If I leave a mass of material in the center of this bowl, it's going to give me good stability for doing that. But I'm going to clear out a little area so that I can start working the inside and get that wall thickness established. You can see here the rotation that I'm making is I'm reaching clear across the lathe, and I have my left hand stable and steady, and that's kind of my pivot point right there on the tool rest, and only my right arm and the handle of the bowl gouge are turning. Think of it like a rudder on a boat. We want that pivot point to be a really solid anchor right there on the tool rest. But you can see how far I need to reach to make this cut because I'm cutting in underneath that rim. Okay, I'm going to use a scraping cut here. I need to be really careful because this is side grain mounted again, so we have in grain and side grain coming around. And if I'm not careful here, I can get a kickback and I can have some issues with the material kicking back the bowl gouge and scratching it up, and I don't want that to happen. So you just make really light scrapes there to shape the curve of that rim. And now I'm going to reduce the center a little bit more and get some of that material out, but I've noticed that my tool's not cutting so well, so it's time to go back to the sharpening station. If you need to learn more about shaping and sharpening your tools, check out my Tool Sharpening for Wood Bowl Turning online e-course, where I cover everything you need to know about shaping and sharpening all of your tools for turning wood bowls. It's all in video form, and each lesson is well indexed. There's a ton of information there. Okay, after I return to the bowl, I can see immediately that sharpening the bowl gouge was the thing to do there. I probably went a little bit longer than I needed to. This wood is so hard, it's a little bit tricky to see or to determine when you really need to sharpen because the tool is not cutting as quickly as it normally does with most other woods. I'm going to reposition my tool rest here and get it right in there so I get good support to make this delicate cut in the inside curve. Again, I'm reaching all the way across that lathe. And I'm starting with the flute closed at 90 degrees so I don't get a kickback. I have a video all about kickbacks, and you're going to want to see that if you don't know how to deal with kickbacks or what causes kickbacks. It's really important to understand that, so check out that video. Okay, so with that inside wall defined towards the rim and down, I'm going to take some of the material out of the center here. I have the tool rest a little bit high here, so I'm going to drop that down. I also have a video all about tool rests, and if you've got questions about the tool rest, check out that video. Just doing light push cuts here again with the bowl gouge flute positioned at about the 1/130 position as I move across. I'm not moving my hands or arms. I'm pretty much have my hands and arms locked, and I'm just doing a shift forward with my body weight. There you can see too, these are roughing cuts, so it doesn't really matter what happens at this point, but you can see when you push through that center how it can tear out the fibers. When we get down to the very bottom of the bowl, we want to make sure that that final cut through the center is nice and slow, and we let the bowl gouge do the cutting, and we don't force out that center portion and rip out fibers, because that can cause a problem with the bottom inside of the bowl. Alright, so now I've got the bowl gouge rotated to the left at about the 10-10-30 position, and I'm clearing out more material so I can get down to that wall on the inside. And I'll flip the bowl gouge around so that the flute is at about the 10-10 or the 1-130 position. And then I will continue shaping that interior wall. As I'm making this cut, I have the flute almost completely open to 12 o'clock. I'm only doing that when I'm making very light cuts. If I get too aggressive with that open position, I'm going to get a catch, and I don't want that. So I'm going to start up at the top, and I'm going to make a very light cut and move around. Now, part of the reason why I have the flute completely open is so that the bevel can actually rotate around that really tight curve. That curve is a little tighter than the length of my bevel. Now this is the view that from where I'm standing, this is how I'm turning. I'm not bent over looking into the bowl. And that's one of the tips that I have in my video about how to improve the inside of the bowl. You might want to check that out as well. I'm using the scraping cut, just a very light scraping cut, to shape the inside of the rim up to where it meets the wall. And I'm rounding that out so it blends in with the rest of the rim. Use your hands and frequently test the surface but also the wall thickness and make sure it's what you want before you progress. It doesn't cost anything to stop the lathe and take a quick check. You obviously want to do that before you go too far and you make an area too thin. Unfortunately, I think we all have to go through making thin-walled areas in our bowls before we learn that lesson really well. Alright, so I'm taking more of the interior material out and making way. So what I'm doing is I'm working down that wall from top to bottom. And once I've established the wall thickness to my liking, then I move down to the next section and blend that into the previous section. Typically, you don't go back up to the top to work that, because when that core is removed, there's going to be a higher chance of vibration on those outside walls. Although this piece of wood is so rock solid, I don't know that there's that much vibration occurring on those outside walls. I know that the moisture content of this piece is very, very low, and I would think that there's going to be almost no movement in this piece after I've turned it. Typically, most bowls have a little bit of moisture in them, and that rim might shape or move just a little bit after the bowl's turned. And obviously, more wet bowls will change more dramatically. There's a good chance this bowl won't change at all. It is rock solid. Okay, so I'm liking that thickness. I'm going to take that inside down and get ready to do the bottom inside of the bowl. You want to take just enough material, or the width of the material, that the bowl gouge will actually cut well. And it's taken about a ½ inch or maybe a centimeter or so of material there. But you can see how it's ripping out and making it's a rough cut there because I pushed through that quickly. So there's almost like a brittle sense to this. I wouldn't call it brittle though, it's not fragile. But the tear marks are so small and tight, it feels like it's crumbling versus tearing like most woods do if you get too aggressive with them. So you want to take your time here and make really light cuts. What I'm doing is I'm merging that previous wall thickness with the current wall thickness. Now there's a high spot up here, and it's kind of in that indentation area, and I'm not feeling really comfortable getting in there with the bowl gouge, so I'm going to use my round nose scraper. Now I've got a video all about round nose scrapers. You might want to check that out. What I'm going to do here is I need that to cut a little bit better, so I'm going to actually pull a burr here in a second. But before I do that, I'm going to mark the location that I want to work. So between those two lines, it's a little too thick, and I want to thin that. Here I'm using a hardened steel burnishing tool to pull a burr on that tip. And what's going to happen is there's a very small microscopic burr there that's actually going to cut more than it's going to scrape. And by doing that, I'm going to be cutting that material and having a cleaner finish. I deal with the how to sharpen and shape a round nose scraper in my tool sharpening course as well, and I also go over exactly how to pull a burr and do this technique, so you're going to want to check that out. Alright, that's feeling pretty good, except now we're getting down to the final cuts, and that's always a good time to go sharpen. the previous sharpenings, I had the camera point of view almost from my point of view because I wanted to share that with you, and it was a little bit awkward actually doing the sharpening portion. This is a little bit better. I have the camera off to the side so you can actually see more fluidly what I'm doing. I'm just cleaning up that bevel. That's all you have to do. Okay, so I want to make sure that I'm going nice and slow here and making a good finishing cut across the bottom of this bowl. You need to remember that the center of the bowl is turning at a slower speed than the rest of the bowl, so we need to slow down our pace and let the gouge do the cutting right at the center of the bottom of the bowl. If you need more information on that, check out my lathe speed video. I go into great detail and explain all the different aspects of the speed. Okay, we've got a little bit there. There's going to be another pass here. This is going to be a relatively open cut. I'm going to pick up the edge there by resting my bevel on the previous cut and just lightly working through that. And before I do anything else, I want to touch and feel this. And I'm going to do one more very light cut to kind of merge those areas all together. We have a very thin section here, probably less than a millimeter, maybe less than half a millimeter. It's getting a little bit thicker towards the bottom. I want to go nice and slow here and just let the tool do the cutting. There we go. Excellent. Now inside that rim, I'm going to use a 2-inch sanding disc. My main disc that I use most often is a 3-inch disc, but I really want to work that inside edge with a smaller disc so I can get down in there. This is a 2-inch sanding disc. And I'm going to go through the grits in the same manner. What I'm doing here a little bit different is I will sand with the lathe running, and then I will stop and I will sand with the grain, and I will clean it up that way. I'm also going to do some hand sanding right now of that beaded exterior rim. And again, I'm going from 120 up to 320. That's 120, 180, 240, and then 320 grits. Now here I'm using the 3-inch sanding pad. I don't go across the center because that will cause problems with the shape of the bottom of the inside of the bowl. Instead, I will turn with the lathe running, then I will turn with the lathe off, and I will clean up that center. I've got a video all about sanding wood bowls. You might want to check that out as well. All right, it's looking really good. It's time to reverse this, and we'll take that tenon off and shape the foot of the bowl. I'm going to switch out the 4-jaw chuck here. I have a smaller one, and I'm going to change this out for my larger. And this jam chuck appears pretty large, but it's actually the right size for the interior of this bowl. I've got a video all about jam chucks too if you want to check that out. It's a quick, very inexpensive way to reverse a bowl and work the foot area. Okay, so I'm going to pull up the tailstock and I'm going to match that little indentation that was made originally when we first started. And by matching that, you should have pretty much a true rotation, and we do. Now I'm going to start nibbling away that tenon because we don't need it anymore. I'm using push cuts in towards the headstock. That's always a good cut to use when you have an end-to-end mounted piece like this, because you're putting pressure into the headstock versus laterally against it. Now I'm going to true up the foot and make sure we got a nice flat foot that's going to rest on the table well. And then to get inside this, I've been using my carbide flat scraper. It helps to find that foot, the edge of the foot. What I want to do is I want the shape of the bottom of the bowl to be nice, fluid, round, so that that round shape moves through the center of the bottom of the bowl. If you were to take that foot ring off of the bowl, you should have a nice, smooth, fluid, round bowl with no foot. That's the idea of what I'm doing here. So I'm back to the 1/2-inch bowl gouge, and I'm using that to shape the material inside and take the little nub down just a bit. And I'm also going to take advantage of this still being on the lathe to sand up the area around the foot and get that nice and smooth. This wood is pretty cool. You can't help but wonder what the heck, where has this been all its life? You know, was it in part of a barn, and how many generations of families has it seen? And it's just, I don't know. I love turning pieces of wood like this. It's just very, very cool. Here I'm using my 3/8 inch spindle detail gouge to take off the little nub. We're going to reduce this down as small as possible, and I'm going to, at the same time, curve the bottom of the bowl to complete that bottom curve that we talked about. So I'm going to pick up the edge there and just very lightly take off just a thin area. Now I'm going to push into that nub in just a second to sever it apart, but I'm going to make it a little narrower first. If you're not comfortable with this, you can just stop here and you can cut that off with a knife and sand it, or you can cut it off with a small handsaw. What I like to do is I'll push forward and apply pressure, but then I'll also turn off the lathe, and I'm going to sever those fibers and break that nub off. And now we've got a completed bowl. I just need to sand that area where the tenon was. And you definitely want to pad that on the jam chuck so you don't scuff up the sanding that was done earlier. So I'm going to use that 2-inch mandrel again to sand the area in that. You just want to be very careful not to touch that foot rim, because the sanding disc will obviously nick that up and make a mark on that rim. And you're going to rotate this around so that you get a nice even sanding finish in the inside. You don't want to make any ruts or flat spots. So I usually sand it from both sides with the grain, and I just kind of rub that back and forth to blend it in. All right, so I'm going to use my burning tool to sand this. What's funny is every wood is different and requires a different temperature. The temperature there is actually pretty good, and the line looks pretty good. I'm usually used to a little bit darker line with wetter woods, so I turned up the temperature. Now it's a little bit too dark. So you've got to play with it and determine what works best. So I took the temperature down just a touch there. You just need to experiment with it. But since I haven't turned 100-plus-year-old oak before, I didn't know what temperature to use here, but now I've got a rough idea. I just take my time to sand this. I use a chisel tip in a lot of instances. There's other pen tools that work really well with sanding as well. All right, now I'm going to apply my favorite finish. I've got a video for this. This is Tried and True's original finish. It is made up of linseed oil and beeswax. That's it. There's no other chemicals, there's no dryers, there's no metals in it, there's nothing. It's linseed oil and beeswax. That's why I love it so much. It's 100% food safe. It's just a beautiful finish. It'll dry with a luster to it. It won't have as much shine as you're seeing here when it's going on wet, but it has a beautiful finish, and it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous finish to use on your wood bowls. The application process is very simple. You essentially just want to have enough finish on the surface to coat the surface. So in other words, if you see finish on the surface, you've got enough there. It doesn't go on thick. It needs to be a nice thin coat. And after an hour, you want to come back with a clean, dry cloth and wipe the surface and take off any high spots or thick spots. Because this material cures and it works its way into the wood, it's just actually a really nice finish. You don't want a thick area there because that'll kind of gum up, and you obviously don't want that. Well, there it is. Boy, I wish this wood could talk, because I'm sure it has some wonderful stories. Look at those medullary rays.
Well, there it is, a beautiful piece of American history right here summed up in this really gorgeous piece of dry, dense, very hard oak. Now, one of the lessons we learned in this, and the question that was asked to me, was how do we turn really hard woods? And the answer is with a very sharp tool. But that's how we want to turn all the time. And that requires sharpening and paying attention to your tool and recognizing when it's starting to become a little bit dull or it's taking a little more effort to cut compared to before. That's when you want to go sharpen again. I think we sharpened 5 times during this turning, so it wasn't out of hand, but we really needed to sharpen. There were a couple times when I actually got pretty dull and I needed to go back. I should have gone back a little bit earlier. And this wood is absolutely beautiful. You gotta wonder where this has been and what it's seen. You know, it's probably at least a couple hundred years old. The tree probably grew for a period of time, maybe another 100 years before that. What did this wood see in its lifetime? It would be amazing to see that. I love history and I love turning, so those two things are always going through my head when I'm turning a piece like this. And this is just a gorgeous piece of oak. I'm just really happy with this piece. I love this little simple beaded rim here, and I love how the center worked out here. And again, that's by turning those grains upside down. Essentially, if we had the whole log, there would be bark out here, and this would basically be the same orientation as turning a natural edge or a live edge bowl, but that was cut off of it when it was milled into a board, so we don't have that feature here. But the orientation of those rings is the same way. And that's the pattern you will see in the bottom of a live edge or a natural edge bowl. If we flipped it the other way, it would look more like a traditional bowl and would have larger rings in there. So it's just a personal preference, but it's one of those things to be aware of while you're turning. All right, if you've liked this video, do me a huge favor, click that like button below the screen. You know, the one with the thumbs up? Yeah, go ahead and click that for me. I greatly appreciate it. It helps me with the YouTube algorithm and it helps get this video out to others so they can enjoy it as well. Thank you guys for watching, and I greatly appreciate you. And until next time, happy turning.